Today, Boris Johnson is going to host a meeting of the world's leaders, the G7 summit. Britain takes over the G7 presidency, but of course it's going to be on Zoom. The question is, what is Boris Johnson going to tell those world leaders? We know that one of the things it's going to be is his pledge to donate millions of surplus vaccine doses to poorer countries as and when we don't need them anymore. Tobias Elwood is chair of the Defence Select Committee and a Conservative MP, and he joins us to discuss. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Good morning. I mean, these sort of world summits, one of the reasons, and leader summits, one of the reasons we have them is so actually people can develop those personal relationships, a lot of sort of eyeballing in the room, getting the cut of each other's jibs, and it actually really does improve sort of negotiating and keeping things on track around the world. On Zoom, perhaps not as workable, but there is essentially some serious stuff on the agenda today for G Summit leaders to actually talk about, not least the spread of the vaccine around the world to their countries and, as we're hearing here, to the poorer countries that don't have access to it.
Yeah, so much to unpick here. I mean, firstly, as international institutions go, they're all looking a bit rickety. They've served well over the last few decades, but the UN, World Trade Organizations and so forth, the G7 is a real possibility to get the leaders of the big countries together and affect change. And the Prime Minister's focus is absolutely right, is on the pandemic, because much as we can celebrate fantastic NHS, our life sciences, which we're strong at, has allowed us to start to emerge from the pandemic, the rest of the world has still got to catch up. So it's fantastic to see the Prime Minister ask those questions about how we look for the future pandemics. Biosecurity is now a big issue. He's putting forward ideas about creating research hubs, having global protocols. We should never see another country, let's say where a pandemic breaks out, deny access to the World Health Organization for an entire year before an inspection can take place. So lots of big questions that can be decided with these very powerful nations.
Well, indeed, and it's interesting. The G7 summit. It's an organisation. It's the UK, United States, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and Canada, and of course, China was included in larger groups beforehand. Russia as well. But actually, this is now the leading economies and the leading democratic states which discuss these things. Does that mean that the G7 can get more done than those organisations which do still have effectively a veto by these totalitarian nations?
You make such an important point. It's because of these powerful countries, China and Russia, are able to use their veto that many of these international organisations that I touched on are not as strong as they once were when they were first created after the Second World War. I've encouraged Boris Johnson to take the G7 and expand it. And you touched on a couple of countries there. Include India, include Korea, include Australia. You get more of than half of the world's GDP. That's a powerful bloc to start to reconfirm security rules, trade rules, which the rest of the world should then appreciate and respect and follow. And, we've discussed China many, many times. China is using its economic might and the fact that we have wobbly rules which aren't enforced. The G7 moved to the G10. I think it will be an incredible legacy for the Prime Minister.
In terms of what they are trying to discuss, the rollout of the vaccine being absolutely crucial to the world's economy, and making sure that vaccine does get to the poorest nations. We know that, America they've donated, I think, $4 billion, Joe Biden has just said, to that scheme to actually make sure that the poorest countries do get hold of the vaccine. But we know that the UK itself has given, I think, more than £100 million more than the whole of the EU has. Now, we know that the vaccine issues has been a real bone of contention between the EU and the UK. You'd think they just learn from our successes on that front rather than just criticise us and have the French president, for instance, criticise the AstraZeneca vaccine, which has led to a lower take-up in France. Well done, Macron. But is there likely to be unanimity on this? Is there likely to be group collective action on this in terms of how we make sure that the whole world gets access to this vaccine?
Yeah, big questions there. Firstly, there is a sense of determination and responsibility that the Western world is able to lead on this, particularly as we're going to come out first. And the fact that the Prime Minister is wanting to move this forward, I think it's where Britain has always been. We do step forward perhaps before other nations, but the pandemic has actually showed how frail our world order is, even with friends and allies across Europe as well. There's a lot of disharmony. People are retreating from global exposure, becoming more isolationist. We're going through a very difficult and I think dangerous era. So the fact that we're now looking at ways to get the actual vaccines out, I would like to see HMS Argos, which is our hospital ship. You may recall when Ebola struck Africa, that was sent up there. Let's do the same again.
I have to say, I'm wondering though why British taxpayers should be funding. I mean, I'm all in favour of us doing it. That's what's necessary. But why should British taxpayers be funding the rollout of a vaccine across the world? Surely all of these G7 nations and others should be demanding that China pays the bill.
Yes, absolutely right. But then again, this is the sort of demands, collective demands that we can make. What we've seen with China is they pluck countries off one by one. Australia dared to suggest there should be an investigation into the outbreak itself. Who was patient zero? Where was ground zero? And they had tariffs imposed on them. If we're going to stand up to China, we must do it collectively. And the one body I think that now has that power is the G7, empowered even further if you take it to a G10. I do agree with you. There will be taxpayers saying, why should we do this? Only if it's brought up and we step forward and show an example, can we get other nations, including groups of nations such as the EU, to follow us.
Yeah, indeed. Never going to happen, though, is it? China are going to get away with it. We'll just go back to normal business. But there we are.
Well,
do carry on.
Should say that this is exactly why the Prime Minister has put the pandemic at the top of his agenda. He wants to establish new protocols for us to follow, establish an early warning system, make sure that when this does happen again, which it will do, it won't cause such huge devastation, battering economies right across the world.